We continue our study of Mark's Gospel, chapter 2, verses 23 to 28. One Sabbath, he was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And he said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need of food? He entered the house of God when Abiathar was high priest and ate the bread of the presence, which it is not lawful for any but the priests to eat. And he gave some to his companions. Then he said to them, the Sabbath was made for humankind, and not humankind for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." We find another instance of controversy, a moment of conflict, when Jesus and his disciples, as if to say, almost they break the Sabbath law, another Sabbath regulation. Now this what they were doing would have been was permitted by the law if it had to be on any other day of the week. In the villages, they were permitted if travelers, passers-by, if they felt hungry, they could break food grains or corns and eat it, provided they don't put a sickle. You can't take and harvest somebody's crops. But on the Sabbath, there were 39 kinds of works that were prohibited. 4 of these works, what they did, come under these different headings. What they did by breaking those corns of grain, those ears of corn, was they were reaping, they were winnowing, they were threshing, and they were preparing a meal under these 4 different heads, which were these 4 different kinds of work. Under these headings were forbidden by the law, by the Sabbath regulations. And when these Pharisees approach Jesus, they confront Jesus saying, "See what your disciples are doing." They thought Jesus would stop them and rebuke them. But instead, Jesus seems to encourage them. Jesus resorts to scripture to justify their action. He takes an incident from the Old Testament, 1 Samuel chapter 21, verses 1 to 6. An incident when David, while he was on the run, he comes to a place named as Nob, N-O-B, and there he comes to a holy place where the showbread was kept. Abiathar is supposed to have been the high priest, but actually when you read the original context, it is Ahimelech who is the high priest, and Abiathar was his son. This was mistakenly mentioned by Mark. So David comes to that holy place, the tabernacle, and he comes and he is given from that sanctuary. He asked for something to eat for himself and his companions. They were hungry, and there was this show bread that would be kept in the tabernacle, before the Holy of Holies. So this is mentioned in Exodus chapter 25, verses 23 to 30, and also in Leviticus chapter 24, verses 5 to 9. It speaks of this showbread, which consists of 12 loaves, which are placed on a table made of gold, a small table around 3 feet in length and 1.5 feet in height, and that is placed before the Holy of Holies. It was supposed to have been consecrated to God. It was placed for an entire week, and after a week, those loaves were replaced with fresh loaves, and those loaves which were removed from there became the property of the priests. Only they were permitted to eat this, and that too in a holy place. Now Jesus says that David and his companions broke the law, and he said that what was considered sacred was used Scripture uses this. It says that there was an exception to the normal rules. Normally it wasn't permitted for anyone but the priest. But on this occasion, the priest himself gives it to David to eat. So Jesus says that Scripture also there are times when certain rules are overlooked. And he's giving the reason. He answers their objection by referring to the Old Testament and also by himself saying something very important. And he says that the Sabbath was not made for man. Sabbath was made for man. Man is not made for the Sabbath. Meaning that even before man was created first, and then came the Sabbath rules and regulations. What Jesus meant was what was considered holy should be put at the service of man and not given more preference than man. Man was the crown of God's creation and he should be treated as such. So he says that he is the one who is overruling this. He is the Lord of the Sabbath. He refers to himself as the Son of Man. This phrase, Son of Man, is used earlier also. As in our study, we've come across this, where he says in Mark chapter 2 verse 10, the Son of Man has authority to forgive sins. And here again he uses it with regard to himself. This title, used in this context, it speaks of him as a representative of God on the earth. The Sabbath was made for man. These are his words. This law, this saying of Jesus was so radical, considered so radical, and Mark is so bold in putting it down, that Matthew and Luke do not use this part of it. They say that Jesus said he was the Lord, he is the Lord of the Sabbath. But they omit that reference where it says that the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. What is our idea of the Sabbath? Or how do we maintain the Sabbath rules and regulations? How do we honor the Lord's day? For us, the Sabbath is Sunday. Sunday fulfills the spiritual truth of the Jewish Sabbath. The idea behind it is Jesus rose on a Sunday. Jesus rose on the first day of the week after the Sabbath. Every Sunday is a mini Easter. It celebrates the Lord's resurrection. Hence we call it the Lord's Day. The Sabbath was a day that God was supposed to have rested. So God's action is the basis for man's action. After his first creation, God rested on the Sabbath, and it was the next day of the Sabbath that Jesus rose from the dead. So Jesus' resurrection is a new creation. So we give importance to Sunday. And how do we keep the Lord's Day holy? The 10 Commandments, it was written in Exodus chapter 20 verses 8 to 10. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days of the week you shall labor and do all your work. But on the 7th day, this is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work. The idea behind all this is to consecrate the day and to keep it holy. Now what exactly does this mean? Does it mean that it's only a kind of a day to idle or laze around? Is it only to do what is meant for God alone? And what about our other responsibilities? It says in Isaiah chapter 58 verses 13 and 14, if you refrain from trampling the Sabbath, we can replace it with the word Sunday, from pursuing your own interests on my holy day, if you honor it, not going your own ways, serving your own interests, or pursuing your own affairs, Then you shall take delight in the Lord, and I will make you ride upon the heights of the earth. Often during this lockdown, this is like one extended Sabbath. In our normal days, how would we keep the Lord's Day holy? Often we would take it only for a day of rest and attend Mass on Saturdays in order to be able to rest and catch up with the work that was left pending for the entire week. But Pope John Paul II said that the Eucharist has to be the central point of the Sabbath, of Sunday, even though the Church permits us to attend Mass on Saturday. This is left for each one of us to decide how we keep the Sabbath day holy. We could refrain from pursuing things which are self-centered. And the purpose behind the Sabbath was to refresh yourself. This rest which we were deprived of, thanks be to God, we are getting this in another way, through the back door during these days of lockdown. We were supposed to refresh ourselves on that one day and also refresh others, the poor. There is a story told of a rabbi, a Jewish rabbi. It was rumored that on the Sabbath, among his disciples, there was a rumor that on the Sabbath he would rise to the seventh heaven. So they kept a watch to see where he would disappear. And one of the disciples followed him. And he goes and he sees the rabbi going to a broken down hut at the outskirts of the city, and he ministers to an old lady. He does all her job, a lady who is in bed, crippled, all alone. And then this disciple of the rabbi comes by himself. He is in a daze. He was asked by the other fellow disciples, did the rabbi rise to the seventh heaven? He says, he rose higher. So the Sabbath is a day that we keep aside to refresh not only ourselves but others as well, and a day consecrated to the Lord. Thank you.